I sat outside the hospital, clutching my hands until my knuckles turned white, realizing I might be leaving here without the man who made my life worth living. The sun was bright, almost mocking, scattering golden light over the glass front of Vanderbilt University Hospital. Dogwoods bloomed along the sidewalk, their petals drifting on the breeze, like confetti from a celebration I wasn't invited to. I should have felt warmth, life, spring itself in full bloom. But I didn't. The world looked the same, but mine was collapsing. Inside those walls, Ethan lay surrounded by machines, the steady beeps measuring the time we didn't have. 6 months ago, we were planning vacations we couldn't afford, talking about a dog, dreaming of children. Now my life was reduced to reading his lab numbers, listening to the rattle of his breathing, and pretending to be strong. I remembered when strength came so naturally to him. He would spend 12 hours in the carpentry shop, sawdust clinging to his shirt, and still come home with enough energy to cook dinner, to smile, to listen to me complain about my long shifts as a nurse. That smile of his could steady me in a storm. And now I had to watch it fade, piece by piece, as if the illness was erasing him from the world. The doctor's words kept echoing. "We are running out of options." Dr. Samuel Price had delivered it gently, as if soft tones could blunt the meaning. But I heard it for what it was. A countdown. A quiet admission that my husband's time was nearly over. I wanted to scream at someone, at the disease, at fate, at the walls that held us. But there was no one to blame. Ethan had no family to step forward, and no relatives to match as donors. He was abandoned as an infant, raised in foster care, never once given the luxury of blood ties. And now, in the cruelest twist, that emptiness might be the very thing that killed him. Walking through the hospital courtyard, I tried to collect myself. Families passed me, fathers carrying flowers, mothers balancing coffee cups, children skipping across the pavement. They belonged to a world of ordinary problems and happy plans. I envied them with a bitterness I hated to feel. That was when I caught a fragment of a conversation. 2 nurses were standing near the vending machines, speaking casually, unaware that I was listening. "You know that guy in ICU, Carter?" one said. "He looks just like this man who lives out in Pine Hollow. I swear it's uncanny." I froze. Pine Hollow. A small town I'd visited once years ago for a nursing outreach. My mind snagged on the words, and it looked just like him. People resembled each other all the time. Maybe this was a coincidence. But maybe it wasn't. I filed the thought away, pressing it down beneath my grief. It was too fragile, too dangerous to believe in. I went back inside, slipping quietly into Ethan's room. He was awake, his face pale, but his blue eyes were sharp as always. He tried to smile at me, and for a moment I let myself imagine we were back in our little house on the edge of Nashville, sitting side by side in the rocking chair he'd made me. But the IV drip at his bedside shattered the illusion. "Long day?" he whispered. I forced a smile. "Always is." His hand felt so light in mine, as if even his bones had grown thinner. I wanted to promise him forever. I wanted to tell him I'd fix this, that I'd find a way. Instead, I said nothing, because words without proof would only be another betrayal of his trust. Later that night, I slipped into the empty family lounge, sat in the corner, and pressed my forehead to my knees. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant filled the air. I thought about our failed IVF attempts, about every time I had wept into his chest and said, "You deserve better than me." Each time, Ethan had tilted my chin and said, "You are my family." He never made me feel less, never blamed me. His loyalty had been whole, unquestioning, and now I was terrified I would fail him when it mattered most. I stared out the lounge window at the city lights, clinging to the memory of those nurses' voices. Pine Hollow, someone who looked just like Ethan. Could it mean family? Could it mean hope? Or was it just another cruel trick of chance? The night stretched on, machines humming behind closed doors, nurses' shoes squeaking on tile. I sat until my eyes burned, until exhaustion dulled the edges of my fear. Still, the words looped in my head, impossible to silence. And then I heard it. 2 nurses talking about a man in Pine Hollow who looked exactly like my dying husband. Hope came to me not as a miracle, but as a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. All through the night, that whisper haunted me. Pine Hollow, a man who looked just like Ethan. I told myself not to cling to it, not to let hope grow too heavy in my chest, because hope could crush just as easily as despair. Yet when I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face and imagined another pair of the same blue eyes staring back from some quiet town a few hours away. Ethan stirred in his hospital bed, restless in his sleep. His lips moved faintly, as though praying or speaking to someone unseen. I brushed the hair from his forehead and whispered promises I couldn't yet prove, that I'd find a way, that this wasn't the end. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay idle. I signed an emergency leave form at the nurse's desk, and my supervisor gave me a hug instead of asking questions. She knew what I was fighting for. My hands trembled as I packed a small bag, slipping Ethan's photograph inside, the one where he was grinning in front of the rocking chair he built for me. That smile reminded me why I couldn't stop now. When I stepped into his room before leaving, he opened his eyes, weak but teasing. "You look like you're about to take on the world." "I might be," I whispered, kissing his forehead. I couldn't tell him more. If this trail led nowhere, I couldn't bear to be the one who gave him false hope. The drive out of Nashville felt like stepping into another reality. The city's high-rises gave way to stretches of farmland and winding back roads. Spring wildflowers dotted the ditches, and fields stretched golden in the early light. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air sting my face. My old sedan hummed steadily beneath me, though every mile felt like a leap into the unknown. I prayed as I drove, not with words but with the ache of my chest, with every tightening grip of the steering wheel. Please let this mean something. Please let there be someone out there. By late morning, I crossed a weathered wooden bridge marked with a faded sign. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." It was exactly as I remembered. A town where time seemed to move more slowly, where people still waved to strangers on the street. Kids pedaled bicycles down dusty lanes. Farmers loaded sacks of feed into their pickups, and porches creaked beneath rocking chairs. Life here had a rhythm untouched by the rush of the city. I parked near the general store, the kind with old glass windows smudged from years of hands pushing them open, and the scent of roasted coffee and dry grain wafting out. My heart thumped in my throat as I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a stocky man in his 50s, apron dusted with flour or feed. His eyes, kind but sharp, flicked to me with curiosity.
"Morning,"
he said. I swallowed hard and pulled out my phone, showing him Ethan's photo. "I'm looking for someone. I don't know his name, but people say he looks like this." For a moment, silence. Then his eyes widened and his hand stilled mid-made motion. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You must be talking about Mike Hayes. Lives out by the cornfields on County Road 6. And you're right, he does look just like this man." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the phone tighter, blinking against the rush of tears. "Could you give me directions?" He nodded slowly, pointing toward the east road. "Follow the main stretch until you see the water tower, then turn right. His mailbox is marked Henderson. Well, Hayes now, but folks around here know both names. Big white letters, can't miss it." "Thank you," I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. I walked back to my car on shaky legs, my bag heavy against my side, though it held almost nothing. Sliding behind the wheel, I set the phone in the cup holder, Ethan's smiling face staring up at me as if urging me forward. The engine rumbled to life, and I pulled onto the narrow road leading out of town. My palms were slick on the steering wheel, my pulse loud in my ears. What if I was wrong? What if this Mike was nothing but a stranger who happened to resemble Ethan? What if I knocked on his door and shattered both our lives with a desperate mistake? But then I thought of Ethan's frail hand clutching mine, his voice whispering that we'd find a way, even as his strength ebbed. I thought of the empty chair beside our porch rocking chair, waiting for a future we hadn't built yet, and I knew I couldn't turn back. The cornfields rose in the distance, rows of green swaying gently in the breeze. Clouds gathered low, carrying a fine drizzle that blurred the horizon. I slowed, searching every mailbox, every turnoff, until I saw it. White letters, weathered but clear. Henderson. I pulled over, the car idling as I stared at the house set back from the road. Old wood siding, grayed with age, a rusted swing creaking in the wind, and muddy tire tracks marking the yard. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, heart hammering as though it might break through my chest. My hands shook on the wheel as I turned onto County Road 6, heading straight toward the man who might save Ethan's life. The man who opened the door had my husband's eyes, the same piercing blue, the same unshakable intensity. Rain clung to my hair as I stood on the porch, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. My knock echoed against the weathered siding, hesitant at first, then louder when no one came. At last the door creaked open, and there he was. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The resemblance was undeniable. His gaze locked onto mine with suspicion, but it was those eyes, Ethan's eyes, that sent a shiver through me. They were framed by a face roughened by years in the sun, with sandy blonde hair falling over his forehead. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep, cautious, tinged with a rough edge that made it clear strangers didn't often arrive at his doorstep. My hands shook as I held out my phone. On the screen glowed the picture of Ethan smiling beside the rocking chair he'd built me. This is my husband, Ethan Bennett. People said you look like him." He frowned, staring at the photo as if it might reveal some trick. His brow furrowed, and then something in his expression shifted, from disbelief to confusion to something painfully familiar. Recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked back at me, his eyes softer now. "Who are you?" "My name is Claire," I said, forcing my voice not to break. "I'm his wife." The man stepped aside, motioning me in. The smell of coffee and motor oil lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of damp wood. His home was humble, mismatched chairs around a scarred kitchen table, boots lined haphazardly by the door, a chipped mug resting on the counter. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair. "Tell me what's going on." I perched on the edge, clutching my bag. "Ethan's in the hospital. He's very sick. They say he needs a bone marrow transplant, but he doesn't have family. He grew up in foster care, abandoned at birth. But then I heard about you and I thought—" My voice broke and I pressed a hand to my mouth. "I had to come." The man, Mike Hayes, as I learned quickly, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He studied Ethan's picture again, his face shadowed with something deeper than surprise. "I think he might be my brother," he said finally. The words weighted as though pulled from his chest. I blinked, unable to process. "Your brother?" He nodded slowly. "Our mom, she wasn't much of one. I had a lot of kids, most of whom were from different fathers. When I was little, she had another baby, a boy. She said she wasn't keeping him. Signed papers at the hospital and left him there. I was too young to stop her, but I never forgot. Always wondered what happened to him." His voice cracked, and he rubbed his face with both hands. "Didn't even know his name until now." Tears blurred my vision. Ethan had lived his whole life believing he was alone, and all this time his brother had been wondering too. Mike stood abruptly, his jaw tight. "I'll do it. The transplant. I don't even need to think about it. If there's a chance I can help him live, of course I will." For a moment, I could only stare, stunned by his certainty. I had imagined begging, convincing him, maybe even pleading, on my knees. Instead, he offered it freely, as though he had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "When do we go?" he asked, already reaching for his truck keys hanging by the door. I rose slowly, my heart pounding so loudly it filled my ears. "Tonight. We need to get you tested as soon as possible." He nodded once, decisive, the kind of man who didn't waste time with hesitation when life was at stake. As he shrugged into his worn denim jacket, I glanced around his home. My eyes caught on a small, battered pocket knife lying on the counter. Initials carved into the handle. A father's keepsake, maybe? A reminder of the family Ethan never knew. My throat tightened. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, streaking the horizon in silver sheets. I slid into my car, starting the engine, while Mike climbed into his old pickup behind me. His headlights glowed steady in my rearview mirror as we pulled away from the farmhouse, 2 vehicles carving through the storm toward Nashville. I gripped the steering wheel, my chest both heavy and light at once. Heavy with the knowledge of what Ethan had lost, light with the fragile hope of what he might gain. As the miles stretched ahead, the thought repeated in my mind like a heartbeat. Maybe this was real. Maybe Ethan's bloodline hadn't ended in silence after all. That evening, as Mike followed behind me in his old pickup truck, I realized hope was no longer a whisper. It was alive, roaring back into our lives. When Mike stepped into Ethan's hospital room, it was like watching a ghost walk in. 2 strangers staring at each other, bound by blood they never knew they shared. The air in the ICU was always too cold, too sterile, but that morning it seemed to freeze me in place. Ethan lay propped up on pillows, his skin pale and thin as parchment. His eyes, though dulled by illness, were still sharp enough to catch the figure behind me. They widened, confusion breaking across his face as Mike stepped into the room. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The steady beeping of the monitor filled the silence like a metronome keeping time on something sacred. Ethan's lips parted. What is this? His voice rasped with weakness. I moved closer, taking his trembling hand in mine. "This is Mike," I said softly. "I think he's your brother." Ethan blinked rapidly, eyes shifting between us, as though trying to make sense of a puzzle he never expected to see solved. His gaze lingered on Mike's face. The same jawline, the same piercing blue eyes, and something inside him seemed to crack open. Mike cleared his throat, his rough voice catching. "I don't know how to say this. Our mom, she left you at the hospital. I was just a boy, but I never forgot. I've wondered about you all my life." The words landed like blows, but not cruel ones, more like truth-breaking chains. Ethan's breath hitched, and I felt his fingers squeeze mine weakly. "All this time," he whispered. "I thought I was—" "Nothing, just a mistake." "No," Mike said firmly, stepping closer, his hands clenched at his sides as if holding back years of guilt he didn't deserve to carry. "You were my brother. You still are." The room spun with emotion, too much to hold. I could barely breathe, watching Ethan's face twist between disbelief and aching recognition. Dr. Price entered quietly, and then his presence ground us back into the reality we faced. He glanced between Ethan and Mike, clearly aware of the storm in the room, but his expression was steady. "We ran the preliminary tests last night," he said gently. "Mike, you're a strong match, one of the best we've seen in a while." I gasped, my knees nearly giving out. Relief surged through me so violently I had to grip the bedrail to stay upright. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, spilling silently down his cheeks. For months we had been standing on the edge of despair, and suddenly the ground shifted beneath us. Mike rubbed the back of his neck, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Guess that settles it then. When do we start?" Ethan let out a shaky laugh. Something fragile but real. He reached out a trembling hand, and Mike clasped it without hesitation. 2 men who had been strangers until yesterday, now brothers bound by more than blood. A chance at life. The rest of the day blurred into a mixture of tests, paperwork, and waiting. I hovered between relief and fear, my heart racing at every footstep in the hallway. Ethan dozed fitfully, waking to glance at Mike as though afraid he'd vanish if he looked away too long. In the waiting room, I sat beside Mike. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale shadows across the linoleum floor. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing. "You know," he said quietly. "I always dreamed I'd find him. Didn't think it would be like this, though. He's fighting for his life, and I'm just stumbling into the right place at the right time." I swallowed hard. Sometimes life doesn't give us what we expect, but maybe it gives us exactly what we need. His jaw tightened, and he nodded. "Yeah, maybe." Later, when I returned to Ethan's bedside, he whispered to me, his voice raw with emotion, "If this works, I'll finally know I wasn't truly abandoned." I smoothed the hair back from his forehead, pressing my lips to his temple. "You were never nothing, Ethan. You've always been everything." The machines hummed softly, a strange lullaby to our fragile hope. Outside the window, clouds shifted, sunlight spilling across the skyline like a promise. For the first time in months, I let myself imagine a future. One where Ethan's laughter filled our little house again, where the rocking chair on the porch creaked beneath our weight, and where family wasn't just a dream. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe. Ethan might live, but could hope survive the storm still ahead? The morning of the transplant, I watched two men walk into surgery, one my husband, the other my husband's brother, both risking their lives to give us a future. The hospital halls felt different that day. The sterile air was heavier, and the fluorescent lights were harsher. Every sound echoed. The squeak of nurses' shoes, the low murmur of doctors' voices, the clatter of metal trays being wheeled toward the operating wing. It was as if the building itself knew the weight of what was about to happen. Ethan looked impossibly fragile as they prepared him. His hospital gown hung loose on his shoulders, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for mine. I tried to smile, but it faltered under the storm rising inside me. Mike stood a few feet away, already in surgical scrubs, his broad frame filling the doorway. He looked steady, but when his eyes met mine, I saw the same fear I carried. "I never thought I'd be here," Mike said with a crooked grin, trying to lighten the air. "Never thought I'd be giving bone marrow to a brother I just met." His voice softened as he looked at Ethan. "But I'm glad it's him." Ethan's lips curved in a weak smile, and he whispered, "Guess life has a strange way of making things right." The orderly gestured, and time seemed to collapse into urgency. I kissed Ethan's forehead, whispering prayers I didn't dare say aloud, then stepped back as they wheeled him toward the surgical suite. My chest ached watching the two men disappear down the corridor, side by side. Strangers turned brothers, walking into something that could either save us or shatter us completely. I spent those hours pacing the waiting room, my legs restless, my hands twisting the photograph I carried of Ethan with the rocking chair he'd built me. Every glance at the clock stabbed like a knife. I thought of the years we had fought together, infertility, heartbreak, disappointment, and how he had always been the one to hold me steady. Now it was my turn to hold on for him. The smell of stale coffee wafted from the cafeteria downstairs. I grabbed a cup, sipping it even though it tasted burnt and bitter. Anything to keep my hands occupied, anything to keep me from shaking apart. Other families sat in the waiting area, some weeping, some clinging to each other in silence. I felt both part of them and separate, locked in my own private battle between despair and hope. Finally, footsteps echoed down the hall, and Dr. Price appeared. His eyes softened as he approached, and I nearly collapsed before he even spoke. "The transplant went well," he said. "Both Ethan and Mike are stable. Now we wait to see how Ethan's body accepts the new cells. But for now, things look promising." My knees buckled with relief, and I sank into a chair, pressing my face into my hands. Tears rushed hot and fast, but for the first time in months, they weren't only born of grief. They were born of possibility. When I was allowed to see Ethan, he was pale, his face damp with sweat, but his breathing steadier. I took his hand, still warm, and whispered, "You're here, you made it." His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment the faintest color returned to his cheeks. Later, when Mike was brought back from recovery, he looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes, but still managed a smile. Ethan's weak hand reached out, and Mike clasped it tightly. "You just gave me a second chance," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. Mike smiled faintly, voice rough with emotion. "Guess we're even now. You gave me family." The words struck me so deeply I had to look away, biting my lip to keep from sobbing. In those few sentences lay the truth we had all been waiting to grasp. Life could be cruel, but it could also redeem itself in ways we never expected. That night, as I sat beside Ethan's bed, the monitors blinking steadily green, I thought about the road ahead. The transplant wasn't a promise. It was a fragile beginning. There would be risks, complications, endless days of waiting and watching, But for the first time, I wasn't walking through that storm alone. Mike was here now, blood of Ethan's blood, proof that abandonment wasn't the end of the story. I pressed my forehead to Ethan's hand and whispered, "We'll get through this, all of us." But even as relief wrapped around me like a blanket, a new fear coiled in the pit of my stomach. Healing wasn't a straight line. The hardest part might still be ahead, but healing isn't a straight line, and as the days passed, I realized survival was only the beginning of a much deeper reckoning. I thought the transplant was the end of our story, but really, it was only the beginning of learning what family means. The days after the surgery blurred into a rhythm of careful monitoring, whispered prayers, and anxious hope. Every morning, I studied Ethan's face for signs. More color in his cheeks, a steadier breath, the faint return of strength in his grip. The doctors warned us to be patient, but patience was agony when life itself hung in the balance. Mike stayed close, rarely leaving the hospital. When visiting hours ended, he slept in a stiff chair in the waiting room, a plaid jacket draped over his shoulders. I often found him watching through the glass at Ethan, his expression caught between awe and guilt. One evening, I brought him a paper cup of coffee. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thanks," then murmured almost to himself, "He's really my brother." I nodded, swallowing against the lump in my throat. "Yes." And he's always wanted to know he wasn't alone. Weeks passed, and Ethan began to improve. The pallor faded from his skin, his voice grew steadier, and on a crisp autumn afternoon, he took his first careful steps outside. I walked beside him through the hospital garden, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the golden light of late afternoon. His hand squeezed mine as he whispered, "I forgot how good fresh air feels." A week later, he was discharged. Driving back to our little wooden house outside Nashville, with Mike's old pickup following behind, felt like returning to a world that had waited too long to welcome us home. The porch, the rocking chair, even the creak of the floorboards seemed changed, fuller somehow, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for this moment. Mike became a regular presence in our lives, his laughter rumbling through rooms that had felt silent for too long. He and Ethan would sit on the porch in the evenings, trading what memories they could. Ethan's scraps of foster homes, Mike's recollections of a broken mother, and the siblings scattered by her choices. One night, Mike handed Ethan a worn pocket knife, the initials of their father carved into the handle. "It's all I have left of him," he said softly. "I want you to have it." Ethan's hands trembled as he accepted it, tears slipping down his cheeks. That knife was more than metal. It was proof that his life had roots, that he belonged somewhere, to someone. The community of Pine Hollow reached out too. Cards, casseroles, and handwritten prayers arrived at our door, even from people we had never met. Their kindness stitched something back together in me. It reminded me that goodness could appear where you least expected it, even in seasons when you'd nearly given up believing. One evening, I stepped into the garage and found Ethan sanding wood again, slower than before, but with the same familiar spark in his eyes. He turned toward me, smiling as he revealed a new rocking chair. "For you," he said simply. I sat down, the wood creaking beneath me in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and tears blurred my vision. We folded Mike into our traditions, too. Sunday dinners grew louder, filled with laughter and shared stories. Sometimes I caught Ethan and Mike exchanging quiet glances, as though they still couldn't quite believe they had found each other. Those moments felt like small miracles, scattered into the ordinary. One golden evening in Pine Hollow, Ethan and I walked along a tree-lined road, the leaves swirling in the breeze. Mike walked ahead with a friend's young daughter perched on his shoulders, her giggles echoing. Ethan squeezed my hand. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think being an orphan meant I'd always be alone. But I was wrong. I have you. And now I have him too." I looked at him, my chest tightening with a mix of grief and gratitude. "Family isn't always about blood, Ethan," I whispered. "But sometimes it is, and it's beautiful." That night, we gathered around a small bonfire behind Mike's house. Flames flickered across their faces, sparks rising into the night sky. I rested my head against Ethan's shoulder as Mike told stories from his childhood, stories that seemed to fill the empty spaces Ethan had carried all his life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Life had broken us, yes, but it had also put us back together in ways we never expected. Sometimes life breaks you just to put you back together, and in those pieces you finally find the family you were meant to have. Sometimes life brings us to the edge of despair before showing us the light we never thought we'd see. Claire's journey with Ethan was not only about saving a life, but also about discovering the meaning of family in its truest form. She carried the unbearable weight of watching the man she loved fade away, yet she refused to surrender to hopelessness. In her courage to act, she uncovered the truth Ethan had been denied all his life, that he was never truly alone. The discovery of Mike was more than a medical miracle. It was proof that love and bloodlines can converge in unexpected, healing ways. For Ethan, it meant shedding the label of an abandoned orphan and embracing the reality of being a brother, a husband, and a man worthy of belonging. The story reminds us that personal honor is not measured by victories alone, but by persistence when everything feels lost. Claire honored her vows not just in words, but in relentless action. She showed that love requires not only loyalty, but also the willingness to risk heartbreak for the sake of hope. Family, too, is a complicated word. It can wound us through absence, neglect, or betrayal, but it can also surprise us with connections we never imagined. Ethan's mother may have abandoned him, but in her absence another path was carved, a path toward reunion, redemption, and healing. The contrast teaches us that family boundaries must be drawn not by tradition alone, but by the people who choose to show up and stay. Self-worth is often tested in silence, in nights of private tears and whispered prayers. Claire's worth was not diminished by her inability to control life or guarantee outcomes. Ethan's worth was not diminished by being discarded at birth. Mike's worth was not diminished by the scars of a broken household. Their union showed that dignity is reclaimed when we recognize that we are more than our wounds. This story urges us to face betrayal not with bitterness, but with an openness to new beginnings. We must resist exploitation by drawing boundaries and refusing the lie that our past defines our future. Healing may come slowly, but it often comes through people and places we least expect. The moral lesson is clear. Love can endure trials that seem impossible. Honor is preserved when we hold fast to our values, and justice often arrives not in punishment, but in the restoration of what was lost. Every broken chair can be rebuilt, every abandoned child can be found, and every weary heart can rediscover peace. The rocking chair on Claire and Ethan's porch is no longer just furniture. It is a symbol of resilience, of evenings spent with a newfound brother, of laughter that triumphed over silence. In the end, their story is not about illness, nor even about survival. It is about awakening. We are awakened to the truth that even when we are abandoned, we are not forgotten. Awakening to the realization that self-respect grows when we fight for those we love. Awakening to the peace that comes when we finally release despair and embrace what life still has to offer. And maybe, just maybe, life sometimes has to break us into pieces to remind us how precious it is to be made whole again. Have you ever experienced this? A moment where despair turned to hope? Or where someone you thought lost forever suddenly returned? If you enjoyed the story, leave the number 1 and subscribe to the channel Family Fallout Stories to hear the next story.